On the morning of October 21st, 1966, 8-year-old Jeff Edwards walked to school in the village of Aberfan in South Wales with his friend Robert, the local GP's son. On the way, they stopped at a local tuck shop to buy sweet shrimps and flying saucers before continuing on towards the school. It was a familiar walk, the kind you don't think about when you've done it every day, and one that for most of the children that morning would never be repeated. The valley was quiet beneath low cloud, the rows of houses stretching along its floor, and above them the hillside rising steeply, dark against the sky. They made their way to Pantglas Junior School with the other children. At the entrance there were the usual goodbyes from mums. Quick words and reminders, a few children hurrying ahead, while others lingered for a moment longer before disappearing inside. It was the end of half term, and some of the children finished at 12 o'clock. A few had asked to stay home that morning, not wanting to go in, but like any other school day, their parents told them they had to go. Above the village, the spoiled tips stood where they always had. Vast mounds of waste from the colliery, built up over years, looming over the valley, but so familiar that most people no longer gave them much thought. And that morning felt no different. But high on the hillside above the school, the spoil tips had already begun to move. What stood above Aberfan was not part of the natural landscape. The spoil tips, vast mounds of waste from the coal mine, were the byproduct of an industry that had sustained the village for generations. Fathers worked underground, sons followed them. The rhythm of Aberfan life was tied to that mine. Everything that could not be used, rock, shale, fine coal and ash, was brought up from underground and tipped onto the hillside, building layer upon layer over the years. By 1966 there were 7 of these tips, 5 of them standing directly above the village. Tip number 7 was the most recent, rising more than 100 feet high and towering over the village below. It was a vast and unstable mass of waste. It had been placed on ground that was known to be wet, with underground springs running beneath it and feeding water constantly into the base of the tip, something that had been observed locally for years. Over time, that water began to change the structure of the tip, weakening it from within. Throughout October 1966, heavy rain fell across South Wales, and day after day the spoil absorbed it, becoming saturated as what had once been compacted and stable began to loosen under its own weight. On the night before the disaster, the tip began to subside. By the morning of the 21st, part of the tip had sunk by several feet, and the structure no longer held firm. When workers arrived at around 7:30, they saw the movement and reported it to their supervisors, and tipping was stopped for the day. But what they could see from above did not reveal what was happening within. Inside the tip, the material had already begun to shift, and inside Pantglas Junior School, the morning had settled into its usual rhythm. In one of the classrooms, Jeff Edwards sat with the other children during a maths lesson, one of around 240 pupils inside the school that morning, most of them between 7 and 10 years old. Books were open, voices quieter now, the familiar pattern of the school day taking hold. There was no sense that anything was wrong. Then, at around 9:15, a sound began to build. At first it was distant, low and unfamiliar, something that didn't belong to the normal sounds of the village. It grew quickly, deepening into a rumble that caught the children's attention. Some looked up, others turned towards the window. The teacher paused, listening for a moment, and told them it was nothing to worry about, just thunder. But above the village, nearly half of tip number 7 had broken away. What had begun as movement within the hillside had become a wave, flowing like a dense black sea and carrying more than 100,000 cubic metres, around 140,000 cubic yards, of liquefied spoil down into the valley below. It rose to the height of a 2-story building and moved faster than anyone could have run, gathering momentum as it descended. It struck the farm cottages first, destroying them and killing those inside, before crossing a canal and a railway line, continuing into the village below where houses were crushed in its path. Nothing was able to stop it. People in the village heard it before they saw it, describing a deep roaring sound like a jet engine. And then it reached the school. At 9:13 on October the 21st, 1966, the school clock stopped ticking. The impact was catastrophic. Walls collapsed as though they were made of paper, windows bursting inward as the black slurry poured into the classrooms, engulfing desks, chairs, and children in seconds. There was no time to react. Some of the teachers tried to shield the children, covering them with their own bodies as the wave tore through the building, but the force of it was overwhelming. Among them was the deputy headmaster, David Dye Bainon, who was later found still holding several children in his arms, having tried to shield them from the collapse. Of the teachers inside the school that morning, only 4 would survive. Within moments, much of the school had been destroyed. In one part of the school, a dinner lady named Nancy Williams had been collecting money from the children when the noise began. As the building gave way, she told them to get down on the floor and threw herself over them, using her own body to shield them from what was coming. The force of the collapse was immediate. She was killed in the impact, but the children beneath her survived. And when rescuers later reached them, they found her still over them, her body where she had fallen, clutching a pound note in her hand. Karen Thomas, one of the children, would later recall how suddenly it had happened, how the noise had come down the corridor before everything gave way, and how she had covered them without hesitation. The children did not realize that Nancy was dead and attempted to pull her hair to wake her. Outside, the wave continued through the village, crushing houses and burying streets beneath the black mass. Water mains ruptured as it passed, releasing torrents that mixed with the spoil and made it even more fluid as it spread. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the movement stopped. The slurry settled and began to solidify, hardening into a thick, suffocating mass, more like wet concrete than soil, in places reaching depths of up to 30 feet. Beneath it lay classrooms, homes, and children. For those inside the classroom, it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Jeff would later remember nothing of the moment itself, only waking beneath the wreckage with a dead classmate's head resting on his left shoulder, and his right foot stuck in the hot water of a radiator. He was buried under the collapsed ceiling with a desk pinned against him. Around him he could hear screams and voices calling out, but one by one they began to fade. For a moment there was silence, and then the village began to move. Those closest to the school were the first to reach it, some having only just left after walking their children to the gates minutes earlier, now turning back towards the place where the building had stood. Mothers arrived first, and with no tools to hand, they began digging where the school had been, pulling at the thick, black tar-like sludge with their hands, calling out names and listening for any sound in return, as others followed behind them. Hundreds of villagers soon gathered, parents and neighbours, all working together in a desperate effort to reach the children buried beneath. Many of the men who arrived next were miners, some coming straight from the colliery, bringing with them an understanding of the material, how it shifted and how easily it could collapse again without warning, but also the knowledge of who was buried beneath it. They tried to organise the digging where they could, to make it safer, but the urgency of it overwhelmed everything else, as parents searched for their children and time became the only thing that seemed to matter. The intensity of the rescue was such that many of the mothers dug until their fingers bled, their hands raw from clawing at the spoil, unwilling to stop. The spoil, which had flowed moments before, had already begun to harden around those it had engulfed, while water continued to seep through it, causing parts of the mass to shift unpredictably with every movement. And still they dug. Within minutes, the first calls for help had reached the authorities in nearby Merthyr Tydfil, and emergency services began to arrive at the scene. Police, fire crews and ambulances made their way into the village, joining the hundreds already digging, while miners worked alongside them, using their experience to guide the rescue and prevent further collapse where they could. At first, there was hope. In the early stages of the rescue, a number of children were pulled from the wreckage alive, some buried but still breathing, trapped within pockets of air beneath the spoil. They were carried away through the crowd and taken to waiting ambulances. With each rescue, parents' hopes were raised by the fragile belief that others might still be found. And Jeff was one of them. It was just after 11 o'clock when rescuers spotted his white hair beneath the debris and began digging towards him, breaking apart the desk that had pinned him in place. He had survived in a small pocket of air. When they reached him, he was passed along a human chain from one rescuer to another until he was carried clear of the wreckage and taken to the playground, where he was wrapped in a blanket and checked over. The digging continued without pause. More people arrived from surrounding areas, drawn by news of what had happened, but the conditions made the work difficult and dangerous. The spoil could suddenly shift without warning, and every movement carried the risk of causing further collapse. Still, the search went on. But as the hours passed, the nature of the rescue began to change as no more voices were being heard from beneath the debris. Jeff was the last child to be pulled out alive, but his friend Robert was among those who did not survive. For some of the children who survived, the loss did not end at the school. As the village was searched, they would later learn that parents had also been killed, the disaster having reached into their homes as well as their classrooms. In total, 36 people had been pulled from the wreckage alive and taken to hospital. For those who remained beneath the spoil, there had been little chance of survival. Many had died from asphyxia, trapped in the confined spaces beneath the debris, while others had been killed by the force of the collapse itself. The focus began to shift, and although work continued at the site of the school, those being brought out were no longer alive. As the hours passed and the rescue gave way to recovery, a whistle would sound whenever a body was found. Each time it did, the noise of digging would fall away and a silence would settle over the site. In those moments there was always a pause, a fragile hope that someone might still be found alive. But when the digging began again so quickly, that hope faded just as fast, replaced by the quiet understanding of what had been uncovered. The digging went on carefully and methodically as bodies were recovered from the hardened spoil and carried away from what had once been classrooms. In the village, a temporary mortuary was established inside Bethania Chapel, a small space that had never been intended for such a purpose, but quickly became the place where families gathered. Parents waited outside in silence, standing in the cold, sometimes for hours, until they were called forward, entering one by one to try and identify their children. Inside, it was not always faces that made recognition possible, but clothing, shoes, or small personal items, and for some, the process did not end with a single identification. There is a story, still told in Wales, of an 8-year-old girl named Beryl Evans, who that morning told her mother she had dreamed that her school was gone, that something black had covered it, before leaving the house as she always did and walking to school. She was among those who died. In total, 144 people were killed, 116 of them children. The remaining victims were adults, teachers, school staff, and residents in nearby homes, many of whom had been caught in the path of the collapse as it moved through the village, or who died in the act of trying to protect those around them. And in a village the size of Aberfan, there were few families who had not been affected. The work at the site did not end with that first day. It continued through the following days and into the next week, as the effort to recover those still buried carried on without pause, day and night, in conditions that remained difficult and unpredictable. The spoil could still shift without warning, and water continued to seep through it, where drains had been blocked and mains had been broken, keeping parts of the mass unstable and dangerous to work within. It was only once the water was brought under control and drainage channels were cut that the ground became safer for those digging. News of what had happened in Aberfan spread quickly, and people began arriving from across the country, drawn by a desire to help. Hundreds came, offering their time and their strength, but the reality of the site meant that not everyone could be put to work. The conditions required experience, and much of the digging had to be left to miners and trained rescue crews who understood how the spoil behaved. To manage the growing number of people, the army was brought in to control access to the site and keep clear routes open for those working and for the ambulances moving in and out of the village. At the same time, journalists gathered in Aberfan, reporting on the disaster as it unfolded. Some did so with care, but others did not, and there were accounts of intrusive questioning and moments where grief was treated as something to be observed rather than respected. In one reported case, a child was asked if they could cry for the cameras for a sibling they had lost. In the days that followed, Aberfan became the focus of international attention. News of what had happened spread quickly beyond South Wales, carried by radio, newspapers and television, and within hours it had reached across the United Kingdom and far beyond it. Messages of sympathy began to arrive from around the world, and people travelled to the village in their thousands, drawn by the scale of what had taken place. Senior figures arrived soon after the disaster. Prince Philip visited the site the following day, walking through the village and meeting those involved in the rescue, while Lord Snowdon arrived during the night, bringing with him little more than a shovel and joining those already working. By the next day, Prime Minister Harold Wilson had also come to Aberfan to witness the devastation for himself. As the recovery continued, preparations were made for the funerals. The dead were buried as soon as it was possible, and on the 27th of October a mass funeral was held at Brintaff Cemetery, where rows of small coffins were laid side by side. 81 children and 1 adult were buried together as thousands gathered in silence to pay their respects. The scale of the loss was visible in those rows of coffins, a generation of children gone from a village where almost every family had been touched. 8 days after the disaster, Queen Elizabeth II came to Aberfan as the village continued to come to terms with what had been lost. Her absence in the immediate aftermath had not gone unnoticed, but she had been advised to stay away while the rescue operation was still underway, out of concern that a royal visit might add to the confusion at a time when every effort needed to remain focused on those still buried. Years later, her former private secretary would reflect on that decision, admitting that he had advised her to delay her visit and that it had become one of the greatest regrets of her reign. When she did arrive, she walked quietly through the village, meeting survivors and speaking with families who had lost children, taking in the devastation that had unfolded there. Those who saw her that day would later recall how visibly affected she was. One mother who had lost her daughter remembered that you could see it in her face, that she was deeply moved by what she was witnessing. For the people of Aberfan, her presence mattered. In a village where so many families were grieving, the visit was not seen as too late, but as something that brought a sense that they had not been forgotten, that what had happened there was being felt far beyond the valley. Among those who understood the delay was Jeff Edwards, the last child to be rescued from the school, whom the Queen would later refer to as the little boy with the blonde hair. He would say that coming sooner would not have been appropriate, that it would only have added to the confusion at a time when the rescue effort was still unfolding. And when she left, the sense remained that she had come not as a figure of authority, but as someone who had stood with the village in its grief. While the Queen's visit had brought comfort to many in Aberfan, there was growing anger towards Lord Robens, the chairman of the National Coal Board, whom many held responsible for what had happened. When he came to the village, his response did little to ease that anger. He suggested there had been no way of knowing the tip would fail, that it had been an unforeseeable event. But for those who lived beneath the hillside, that was difficult to accept. The spoil tips had never been entirely trusted. Many of the men in Aberfan worked at the colliery and understood the nature of the waste being tipped above their homes. There had been concerns for years, not just about their size, but about their stability. As far back as 1944, part of another tip had slipped and come to rest just a short distance from the village. Smaller movements had followed in the years after, each one a warning that the ground above Aberfan was not as secure as it appeared. Tip number 7, the one that would eventually collapse, had caused particular concern. It stood directly above the school, and when it shifted in the early 1960s, those worries had been raised again. Residents had written to the National Coal Board, pointing to water running through the tips, to blocked drains, to flooding that carried black residue into the village. Concerns had also been raised about drainage, with systems intended to carry water away from the tips either inadequate or left unaddressed. Despite repeated complaints, no effective action had been taken. They had been assured that action would be taken, but it wasn't. The ground beneath Tip 7 was known to contain underground springs, something that had been recorded long before the tip was ever placed there. Springs had been marked on relevant maps since 1874. Water flowed constantly through it, weakening the structure over time, and yet tipping continued. In the aftermath of the disaster, the National Coal Board maintained that the presence of those springs had not been known, but that too was disputed. On October the 25th, 1966, the Secretary of State for Wales formally appointed a tribunal to inquire about the disaster. At first, the board had stated that it would not attempt to avoid responsibility, that it would cooperate fully in establishing the cause of the disaster. But as the inquiry progressed, that position became harder to reconcile with the evidence being presented. The mechanism of the collapse itself was not in doubt. The tip had become saturated by weeks of heavy rain, the water within it turning the mass into a fluid that could no longer support its own weight. The question was not how it had happened, it was whether it should ever have been allowed to happen at all. After interviewing 136 witnesses in an inquiry that lasted 76 days over 5 months, the tribunal published its report on August 3, 1967, placing full responsibility on the National Coal Board. They accused the organisation of ignorance and ineptitude in handling events that led to the disaster. The report made clear that the process had taken longer than it needed to, noting that much of that time could have been avoided had the National Coal Board not resisted attempts to place responsibility where it belonged. It found that warnings had been overlooked, duties neglected, and concerns raised by residents had not been acted upon. The disaster had not been an unavoidable accident, but the result of failures in judgment, in management, and in the response to warnings that had been raised over many years. 9 individuals were identified in connection with those failures, and yet despite those findings, no one was prosecuted, no one lost their job, no one was held criminally accountable. Lord Robens remained in his position, offering his resignation only after being assured it would not be accepted. For many in Aberfan, it felt as though those responsible had not been held to account. In the aftermath of the disaster, a relief fund was established to support the survivors and the families of those who had been killed. Donations came from across the United Kingdom and from around the world, and in time more than £1.7 million was raised, a reflection of how widely the tragedy had been felt. But the way that money was handled became a source of deep and lasting anger. The fund was overseen by the Charity Commission, and strict conditions were placed on how it could be distributed. In some cases, payments were refused entirely. Families were asked to demonstrate how close they had been to their children before compensation could be approved, and those whose children had survived but were traumatised by what they had witnessed were often deemed ineligible for support. Even the cost of gravestones was not initially covered. At the same time, the National Coal Board offered compensation of its own. At first, parents who had lost a child were offered just £50, around £900 in today's money. Following public outrage, that figure was increased tenfold, but it went no further. There was a view within the board that larger sums would not be appropriate, that working-class families could not be trusted to manage that kind of money. While these decisions were being made, the remaining spoil tips still stood above the village. They were a constant presence and a visible reminder of what had happened, and for many a continued source of fear. Requests for their removal were resisted, with assurances given that the tips were safe. Frustration grew. At one point, in an effort to be heard, villagers carried bags of coal slurry into the offices of the Welsh office and emptied them in protest. Those involved were arrested. In the end, the cost of removing the remaining tips did not fall fully to the National Coal Board. Instead, a significant portion of the money came from the relief fund itself, money that had been donated to support grieving families. The removal took years, and although the funds were eventually repaid decades later, they were returned without interest, leaving the fund substantially diminished. For many in Aberfan, it was not just what had happened on the day of the disaster that stayed with them, but what followed after, and the sense that even in its aftermath they had not been treated fairly. Time moved on, as it always does, but for those who lived through that morning, what happened in Aberfan did not fade with it. The physical wounds healed where they could, but the psychological impact was profound. Survivors suffered unimaginable nightmares and lived with anxiety and grief that did not fade. Children who lived grew up in the shadow of those who did not. Jeff would later say that he grew up without friends, and that was hard to cope with. A small community had been permanently changed, and many suffered PTSD without ever being offered any form of support. The village was rebuilt, the hillside above was cleared, the spoil tips removed, and over time the land changed its shape. Grass replaced the thick black scars, and to someone visiting now there is little to suggest what once stood there. But for those who live in Aberfan, they know exactly where the tips once rose above them. They know the line the hillside used to take. They remember the sound. And for many, the impact was not something that could be cleared away. For those who were children that day, life did not simply return to what it had been. As Jeff Edwards would later say, one moment they were children, and the next they were living with something they would never fully leave behind. In the years that followed, he devoted much of his life to helping others, supporting fellow survivors, serving his community in Aberfan, and later as Mayor of Merthyr Tydfil, while continuing to speak about what had happened so it would never be forgotten. For that work, he has just been awarded an OBE by King Charles. Soon after the disaster, changes started to be made. New legislation was introduced to govern the management of spoil tips, placing clear responsibility on those who operated them and strengthening the systems meant to prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. It was a recognition at last that what had happened in Aberfan should never have been allowed to happen at all. Other changes followed, not just in safety, but in how institutions were expected to answer for their actions. Today, Aberfan is quiet. Pantglas Junior School is gone. In its place is a memorial garden. Nearby, rows of white arches mark the children who never came home. To a visitor, it is peaceful. But for those who live there, it is something else entirely. Because they remember that morning, the walk to school, the voices at the gate, the children begging to stay home on the last half day of school, and how within minutes everything changed. Jeff Edwards walked to school with his friend that morning. He walked through those gates just like he always had, but he never walked through them again. This was a very difficult story to tell because it affected a small community so very badly, with so many young lives being ended before they had really begun. Our condolences go out to the families of those who lost their lives, both the children and the adults, and our best wishes to those who were injured. Despite the tragic nature of this incident, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.